Okay, does it work? Everybody hears me? Perfect. Yeah, thank you Bartlomiej, thank you Agnieszka, thank you everyone who's invited me, and yes, hi everyone, dzień dobry. Yes, my name is Daniil, and I'm a digital humanities coordinator at the University of Potsdam, and also the co-editor of DraCor. I'm actually going to talk about DraCor today. So it gives me great pleasure really to talk about DraCor and DraCor community in front of so many people who are interested in digital scholarly editions and also in digital research of literature, which is one of my passions. And therefore, I really hope I'll make this talk interesting to you and also a bit entertaining, hopefully, and also maybe even a bit provocative. So bear with me, but I hope at least it will be fun. So, but first, a question to you. Who has heard about DraCor before reading the whole program of the conference? Okay, some people did, very good. We are doing our job. Some people didn't, also very good. It means my talk will be at least somewhat useful to some of you, very nice. And now a more provocative question. So who has heard bad things about DraCor? Or maybe critical things, like things that people didn't like about it? What, no one? That's weird, but also very good, because you will hear some from me today, actually. So yes, well, maybe not very bad things, like we're not eating dogs or something, but bad in the context of what's been said here about digital scholarly editions. So, because actually, despite what you might think looking at my DraCor t-shirt, I'm not here to sell DraCor. DraCor is not a commercial project. It has no commercial component whatsoever. It's just an enthusiast scholarly project which strives to do some scholarly contribution, and therefore it's actually happy to be criticized and happy to engage in critical discussions of what are the limits and what should we do differently. So that's why I'm actually going to talk a bit about like the dark sides of DraCor. So here's the plan of my talk for today, actually. First, I'm going to talk about what DraCor is in a nutshell. This will be really short and condensed, so really just like 5-10 minutes of really condensed information of what DraCor is and what it gives to a researcher. So in case you fall asleep after 10 minutes of my presentation, you will still know enough to get the gist of it, to know what's possible. So just in case, I prepared this short introduction, and then I will try to show how it actually works as what I would call data delivery infrastructure, basically. So an infrastructure which delivers data to quite a wide range of researchers. And this will be the biggest part, really. This will be the part which I think is the most useful for the professional community. So basically for you, for the people who actually make with their own heads digital editions, or who build other types of research infrastructure for researchers, because I think this is where DraCor can actually offer some approaches. I wouldn't say set an example, but offer some approaches and models which allow you to make such a resource, such a data delivery infrastructure, which actually is useful far beyond your original team of the people who made it. And this, I think, is really something to value, because I know a lot of projects which didn't make it to the stage, which didn't make it basically beyond their own team. And this is why I think that it's useful to know a bit about the DraCor experience. And then towards the end of my talk, I'll also briefly speak about DraCor as a community, because of course, as Maciej already said, there is also the social component of the community component of it. And since this conference is called, like the topic of the conference is micro-communities of practice, well, I guess that's what we are, because we are a really small community and we are doing something, so we are a micro-community of practice, I guess. And finally, the promised bad part, like the promised grain of salt, I will talk about what DraCor isn't in the context of this conference and why you should be careful about DraCor. So what is DraCor, essentially? Well, the simplest answer would be like, it's a web resource which is available if you go to dracor.org. But of course, it's not just some random web resource. It's a collection of European drama, a scholarly collection of European drama. By now, almost 4,000 plays. But of course, if it were just the text of the plays, it would be no different from some kind of an online library, right? So there wouldn't be anything interesting about it. So what makes it different from an online library is that it's encoded in TI. And I hope I don't have to speak a lot about TI here, because Sorry? Yeah, because I hope TI is something dear to most people, doing digital editions, or people, who are working with digital editions. And on top of this TI, we have something else which is actually the core of my talk. We have what I would call data delivery infrastructure, or rather researcher-friendly data delivery infrastructure, and what my colleagues at DraCor also call programmable corpora. So the idea here is DraCor is not just some static collection of TIs, or just some website which represents and renders TIs. It's actually a query machine. It's a thing that you can ask and get some data in response. And this data is, of course, based on TI, but you get it in a much simpler form, in a form which is much more suitable for immediate research, immediate visualization, immediate rendering as network, as a diagram, as things like this. So, and you might ask, okay, if it's a data delivery infrastructure, what does it actually deliver? Well, it delivers quite a range of things. So first of all, of course, the text of the place, the full text of the place, but that's not really something that's super interesting, right? I mean, any online library can do that. But that's not the end. So it also delivers semantically segmented parts of the place. For instance, with DraCor, you can send a query like, give me all female speech, so of all characters who are identifiably female, in the German place between year A and year B. And then you get it in form of plain text, basically, which can be processed, which can be analyzed, which can be, you can basically do anything you want with it. What also is possible is obtaining the social networks of the play. And I will speak later in this presentation about why this is useful for literary research, why this model is helpful. And this is really one of the core offers of DraCor, basically without network analysis, and without network analysis coming to literature, there would be no DraCor. So this was really the historical nucleus of DraCor, was around literary network research. And finally, last but not least, DraCor also delivers you metadata, which of course comes from TI header. So those of you who know TI also know that all the metadata in TI is stored in TI header, and this is where where you get the data from, but you don't get it in the form of XML that you have to parse with, using some XML parsers or some XPath expressions of all these things you need to know to parse XML. You get it in a much simpler form, in the form of usually either the CSV or JSON. So basically in the form of a table. And actually this is pretty useful. So my last research paper, for instance, was dedicated to the study of libretti, and we did it entirely just on metadata tables from DraCor. So we didn't really even go into the individual play data, we just did it with metadata. So metadata on DraCor corpora is really something you can do like an entire research contribution with. And yes, of course, this was all about infrastructure and technical things, so things related to data and data delivery. But there's also, of course, a social component to it. So there is a component which is the collaboration between two, which is the fact that DraCor is the collaboration between two German universities. It was also partially funded by one European Union project, but that's not really. I would say that's not really the core of it, because yeah, sometimes you get funded, sometimes funding ends. The real thing is the community around DraCor, and like some people there do get paid sometimes for doing some things for DraCor, but mostly they do get paid for other things. They get paid for teaching, they get paid for working as IT developers, they get paid for very other different things, and that's really not the point here. So DraCor doesn't really depend on any sort of line of funding, on any sort of university. It has been hosted by some other universities at some points in its earlier lives. The point here is the community is alive, and the people are doing it. Some of them are doing it for money, but most of them are doing it for fun. Sometimes they do it in the evenings, on Saturdays. Yeah, basically because they like it, or because they started the project and now they feel responsible for it, or because they just like encoding plays or like automating stuff. And some people just like automating stuff and they are doing it. So it's quite a diverse international community of researchers, of educators, of coders, of encoders, of developers, of students, of data contributors. And I think that's really something I learned to value over the years of my engagement with DraCor. And I've been engaged with DraCor for pretty long, basically. I invented the name DraCor, actually. Yeah, but yeah, I wouldn't qualify as a founder anyway, but I did. Yeah, and this first part of this slide, so the first 2/3 of this this slide really constitutes the infrastructural side of DraCor, so basically the technological side of it, and I will speak mostly now about it. And the last two bullet points are what I would call the social side of DraCor, the organizational side of DraCor, and I will speak about it later towards the end of my presentation. Yeah, so this was probably the most condensed slide in my talk. So if this is everything that you take away from it, so that's already quite a lot. And I also tried to condense it even further so that it was just one thesis, basically one idea. And basically, if you need one idea to summarize my talk, this will be this. So DraCor actually connects data with researchers who need it, and also with researchers who create it. And these two groups overlap quite frequently. So of course, there are people who at some point they need the data from DraCor and to do research, but also at some point they realize they want to upload more data to DraCor and use the possibilities that it gives, which we will cover in more details later, and use the possibilities that it gives to do their research. So it's really a two-way process. So people take data from DraCor and then they update DraCor and bring more corpora, and that's how it proliferates basically. Okay, so this was the DraCor in a nutshell part. Now let's get into the more details. And as I said, I will first talk about DraCor as basically TI-based data delivery infrastructure without going too technical, because I'm not the technical director of DraCor. I'm more like on the data preparation side and the research side. But I will speak about, so I'll try to stay in between, in this kind of precarious position between infrastructure and research. So there will be some things about research and some things about infrastructure. So yeah, what happens if you go to dracor.org? This is what you see basically. You see this front page, and even here on this front page, you can already see some rather interesting statistics, which already gives you the hint of what's encoded and what kind of data is available. For instance, here you can see, if you look closely, on here you can see this M and F for each corpus. This is actually the total number of male and female characters, if they are identifiable as male and female, in each corpus. And you already can kind of compare some things. For instance, you see that for German corpus, it's actually quite uneven. So you have this 11,000 German males there, and just 3,000, just above 3,000 females there among the characters. And for instance, if you compare it to French corpus, you already see that the distribution is a bit different there. So the French corpus is kind of more evenly distributed. So yeah, kudos to French. They have like a bit less than 7,000 males and a bit and almost 4,000 female characters there. So this is already kind of something that gives you the idea of what could be queried from DraCor. Now, of course, this is not really scientific. This is not very scientific to compare them like that, because, yeah, I mean, God knows what's there in this corpora, and I can tell you that they are really different in terms of like the span, the temporal span that they cover. They are quite different. So it's not really good to compare them like this, but this already gives you the idea of what you can look for. And of course, the corpora that you see here are sorted by the number of plays, and you can see it's quite unevenly distributed. So it's really an uneven distribution of how many plays we have for each literature. And if you click this arrow below there, so you see this small tiny arrow here, if you click it, you can see some other corpora which are smaller, which are growing at the moment, but are actually much smaller by an order of magnitude smaller. And you see here, for instance, I think the most recent addition actually to DraCor is the Polish corpus, made by people from Katowice and from I think with some assistance from Wrocław as well. And you can also see here some other smaller corpora which are there. For instance, the Alsatian corpus, which is in the Alsatian dialect, actually, that plays in Alsatian dialect. The Spanish corpus, which is for historical reason not united together with a much bigger Calderon corpus, don't ask why. And finally, you can see the really small Tatar corpus, which I created at some point at the hackathon 5 years ago, and keep promising to increase ever since, but you know, there is always something more urgent. And lately, like this last 2 years, I was actually engaged with, you know, creating and growing Ukrainian corpus, which seemed to be more important a bit, you know, this last couple of years. So someday I will get back to you, Tatar corpus. Please wait. Yeah, and what actually happens if you go into the, if you click on a corpus? So if you click on one of those cards, you land into this menu where you see all the plays of a corpus. So let's look at the German corpus, which has now more than 700 plays, which are relatively well encoded, I would say. And here you Sorry, I think it maybe just ran out of battery. Could it be? Yeah, so thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Does it work? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so what do you actually see here if you look at the individual corpus? You see this TI button there, and of course you can investigate the TI under the hood. I wouldn't pay too much attention, I wouldn't spend too much time now speaking about the TI, because it's a pretty straightforward dramatic TI, I would say. So it has a TI header with metadata about the play, when it was written, when it was first staged, if we have this information, when it was premiered at the theater, when was the first edition. It links to the digital source, it tries to have the bibliography of the original source. It also contains the information about the characters. So in the party desk, you have this some information encoded formally about the character, like the set gender, for instance, and some other stuff sometimes. And it encodes actually the text of the play proper, and it's a pretty standard dramatic TI. And the main things that are important for us, for DraCorians, when we encode things, is the correct encoding of acts and scenes with divs. So basically the structure of the play, so which act of which scene of which act are we in at the moment in this particular part of the text. And then the second, so this is really the backbone of many data and many data models that we deliver in DraCor. And the second thing that's important is this character speech linking with character identification. So basically, if you have a character which is named differently across the text, or which is sometimes not named at all, like you have Gretchen, and then you have Margarita, and then you have just a dot, and then her speech, but you still know it's the same character when you read it. So this is, for us, this is really important to encode this character with the same ID, which is in this case Gretchen, so that in all the models, this speech is all attributed to this particular person, to this particular imaginary being, basically, with its own set of properties. Yeah, and now let's get back to the website and interface. So if you want to explore TIs further, they are all available on DraCor website, so you can look at them. Let's get back to the website and its interface, and finally start exploring the data delivery part, like the thing that I promised, actually. So if you click here on top, you will obtain actually the metadata table for the whole corpus. So this will be the aggregate of all these 700 plays in the form of a table. And I specifically made this screenshot kind of unreadable so that you got the impression of how big this table is. Yeah, it's actually quite big. So it's like it has 700 rows, obviously, for each play, and it has more than 40 columns with all sorts of metadata. So some of it is just, title, subtitle, link to Wikidata, link to original source of the text, and so on. And some of it is more interesting, like the date of first staging, if we know it. And some of it is actually just some numbers, which will first seem strange to you, but which actually bring us to the network analysis. So there are actually some network characteristics of the play, such as density, such as average clustering coefficient, and some other characteristic, which might sound foreign at the moment. And now I will actually go into the details here. So if you actually click on a play itself, so if you do that on any play, on any of those 4,000 plays, what you will see first is actually a network model, so a network structure. There is much more here. You note this menu here, but the first thing you see is network, and that's not a coincidence. DraCor really is very much centered, or historically was very much centered on network analysis of drama, and this was really the core offer. And it's a co-occurrence network, so meaning that those who are connected are the characters who basically co-appear in the same scene of the same act of a play, if it's divided into scenes and acts, and who speak at the same time. So basically, it's a very formal, and one could say reductionist, model, a proxy for who speaks to whom in a play, basically. And yeah, there is a lot of criticism could be said towards this model, but there's also quite powerful benefits of having that model, because it actually offers you quite a lot of machinery from the network analysis, which has been developing for hundreds of years in mathematical sciences and then in social sciences for the last 100 of years at least. So that's why many literary scholars turned their attention to network analysis in the last couple of decades. And yeah, to quote Mark L.G. Hewitt, intuitive to grasp and yet mathematically complex, networks are an immediately accessible quantitative methods for the study of literature. And then he has a point about why it's actually good for the study of literature. And I have my rather simplified answer why you might consider networks for the study of literature and for the study of character system in particular. First of all, network analysis is about centralities. So about how important, how central is this particular node in a network is. And there is quite a number of measures which measure these centralities. So some of them just calculate the number of connections. Some of them just calculate the number of connections times the frequency of this connection. So how often does a character A speaks to a character B. And some of them are a bit smarter, like this betweenness here, the second measure which I mentioned. They actually try to assess how important is the character in the whole structure of the network. So what would happen if you remove it, for instance, or how many other characters are connected through this character if they are not connected directly to each other. So there is quite a well-developed machinery of these centralities. And if it still looks unclear to you, just look at this very simple picture. So here, in the left side, you see the very basic. You see an element A with a very basic degree centrality, high degree centrality, which means like the number of connections, basically. And here on the right side, you have an element which doesn't have the most connections in this network, but you can still see it's very important because it has this high betweenness centrality. So basically, it's important for the overall structure. So maybe this simplified model will help you to grasp what's going on here. Yeah, and actually sometimes there are really interesting research plots, I would say research directions, which are on the intersection of these two centralities. So for some characters, for instance, they really correlate. So they are number one in a play by this degree centrality, which is just the number of connections, and they are also number one by betweenness. But sometimes they aren't. Like in this case, Faust and Mephistopheles are top two in Faust by both network centralities, but Gretchen, Margarita, the love interest of Faust, is actually, she's much lower by degree centralities because she doesn't really speak a lot in that play, but she is much higher by betweenness, which actually I think has a meaning because that's how you differentiate her from some just random secondary character who might speak to a lot of people, but he's not very important for the overall structure of the play. So this is one thing that's really interesting about networks. And the second thing that's interesting is the clustering, is the groups of subnetworks, which often can be identified, not always, but often can be identified if you create such a network from a play. So basically here you see that there are these tight-knit subclusters, subcommunities of characters within this network, and these groupings, very often they inform us quite a lot about how the play is created. Sometimes they are spatial, let's say, and they identify different spaces in which things take place. Sometimes they are chronological and they identify different time spans in the action. So they have quite different functions, and you can't reduce it to one function, but it's quite important. And one of the early proponents of this idea that actually building a network based on a play even claimed that he found a region of death in Hamlet when he analyzed Hamlet using network analysis. Now, this work by Franco Moretti from 2009 has already been criticized a lot as being a bit too simplistic and not really modeling the plot of Hamlet, but still this idea of Moretti that networks make visible specific regions within the plot and that you can find this kind of warring poles of different sides in a network, this actually seems true to me because I found a lot of other plays, like historical plays, for instance, where you really see that groupings in a network, that clustering in a network really shows you some opposing parties, for instance, or some opposing forces. And yeah, Moretti actually compares network analysis to an X-ray. So yes, you reduce your model, you reduce simplicity when you do X-ray. Like, instead of a whole human, you have just a skeleton, and this is also what's happening here, but also this X-ray is useful because it makes you see things which you don't see when you look at a human, but you do see when you look at his bone structure, right? So I think that's this whole proposition here still stands. And whether Moretti was right or wrong, the thing is, we need this. We need to at least be able to use this model to see if he was right or wrong. And whereas he sketched his network basically by hand and pencil, DraCor users can actually obtain thousands of them ready at hand and use it and to double check on what he said and also to analyze their own interests. So not necessarily Hamlet, not necessarily English plays. And as you've noticed, by the way, English is not the top language in DraCor, so for a change, go continental Europe. Yeah, and DraCor users actually have thousands of them ready at hand and can use them to analyze other plays or to analyze the same play but come to different results. And actually, for each play, you can download the network. So you can download the network in a machine-readable form. You don't just have to look at it in DraCor. You can download it, for instance, in the form of a CSV table of edges. So who speaks to whom, how often, basically, this is what is encoded in this table. And then visualize it wherever you want. Like, I love Gephi, but some people like NetworkX or some other programs. And yeah, this is readable by any software which processes networks, basically. And there's also GXF if you like it. But also, you don't really even need to launch software which analyzes networks to, for instance, do the same thing that Moretti did here, because you also have these files here, which is list of characters, which actually contains already all these centralities, and you can download it. And this table is different, so it's not a metadata table for all plays anymore. It's actually a table which just contains all the characters in this particular play. So this one is for Hamlet, but you can get it for any play on DraCor. And this lists all the centralities which I just mentioned there, so you can sort the characters according to any network centrality that you like. And yeah, and to show you how you can use it, let's again go back to Moretti for a second. So in this work of his, he ponders quite a lot about Horatio in Hamlet and his role. And he basically claims he had never understood the role of Horatio until he looked at the play network structure. And what Moretti does in this work, again with his sketches with pencil and pen, he tries to iteratively remove one character after another from this communication network of Hamlet and show what happens after that. And he says, yeah, basically, if you count just the connection of Claudius, of King Claudius, he has more connections than Horatio. So he's not the most central according to this basic degree centrality. But if you remove him, it doesn't really disintegrate the whole play. And if you remove Horatio, it does really disintegrate like the whole play. So that's his kind of selling point there. So he says, yeah, Horatio is less central than Claudius in quantitative terms, in terms of degree, but his removal has a much more drastic consequences. And of course, if you know a bit of network theory, you might realize that this is exactly the case for comparison of different centralities. You don't really have to dissect the network to see this. You just need to measure betweenness and degree. And this is really what happens. So I took this data from DraCor when I was preparing these talks, and last week I just visualized the different centralities for characters, just using this table which you've just seen. And indeed, it is the case. So Hamlet is more central by more traditional centralities such as degree, so who speaks to whom and how often, basically. And there you have Hamlet and then Claudius and then Gertrude, and only then Horatio. So Horatio doesn't really speak too much, and he doesn't really speak to too many characters in Hamlet. But if you take his betweenness, so how important is he as a hub, as someone through whom the connections are made, he is really the champion, at least in this model. He is even higher than Hamlet. And of course, you can take the data from DraCor and visualize different centralities, again, by making nodes proportional to the size of centrality. And on the right side, you see that Horatio really stands out, because here the label and the node is made proportional to the betweenness, and here it's made proportional to the degree. So here you see that Horatio is not the champion. So Moretti seems to have made a point, even though he didn't really use any maths behind the network science. Horatio is indeed less central in terms of degree, but still more important for holding the entire play together, if you can say so, which can be measured by actually measuring the betweenness centrality. And there are a lot of other interesting cases in other literatures on this mismatch between betweenness and degree, but I will not go into them. So my personal favorite is the messenger character of Gavrilo Pushkin in Pushkin's Boris Godunov, but I will not go into it because this is not a network analysis lecture. This is a lecture about DraCor. And so I will proceed further and speak about one more research possibility which this data delivery infrastructure gives, and this is the larger scale analysis. So basically the third meta benefit of using DraCor network data is that you can actually scale it to many more plays. And this is not something that you can do with a pencil and pen like Moretti did, because this is already hundreds of play, and in some cases even thousands. And this gives you the possibility to go a bit upper, to go a bit more high level, and try to maybe track this kind of structural evolution of plays across time in different literatures. So for instance here, let's look at this simple, this example. This is a short span in the history of German drama, from like 1740s to 1780s in DraCor. And what immediately draws your attention here, I think, is this play in the center. This is Götz von Berlichingen, and you can immediately see that it's structurally very kind of different from everything else. It's some kind of a polycentric play with much more characters, with a very different structure, which looks kind of very different from all these plays which have just a small number of characters, all tightly knit in a really small kind of in a really small one center kind of play. And what happens here is actually Goethe consciously rejects the traditional unities of classical theater to follow Shakespearean model of historical play and to highlight this homogeny, this homophily of Goethe and Shakespeare. Here I would like to juxtapose just two networks. One is this Götz von Berlichingen. Yeah, it's a historical play about a German knight and his quarrels with the king. And one of historical Shakespeare's plays, in this case Henry VIII, and you can already kind of see, already intuitively grasp that they're kind of similar structure. They look similarly. You can see these different kind of subclusters which don't really occur in the more classical plays. So you wouldn't meet a single antique Greek or antique Roman play which would look like this, but you will see quite a lot of Shakespearean plays, the historical Shakespearean plays, which do look like this. And what's interesting here is that it gives you a comparative angle, because you can go and look for other such plays in other literatures, and the same thing actually happens in Russian literature a bit later with Pushkin, who in 1825 writes his historical play, Борис Годунов. Again, you've already seen it once here. And here we know for certain, Pushkin explicitly writes it, that he sacrificed, quote, the classical unities to the altar of our father Shakespeare. That's a quote by Pushkin translated by me. And you can actually see it here in the network structure. And this is, I think, interesting. So you can basically go on, figure out which characteristics formally separate such plays from such plays, and look at when, for instance, this Shakespearean intervention happens in different literatures. And I think this is really interesting. This gives us some perspective into the evolution of drama. And yeah, this can be formalized with different ways. And one way that DraCor has tried is actually this idea from social sciences, where they have this idea of small world networks, which is basically comes up to all these experiments in the 60s of sending, mails to random people and seeing how fast they reach the target, and all this 4-6 handshakes idea. And this small world property can be expressed mathematically, and the people at DraCor actually tried to find, okay, which networks in DraCor have this small world property, and it turns out that actually many of those historical plays, many of those plays modeled according to Shakespeare's model, they actually do possess this small world property. And this is really, I think, interesting and gives you again another angle towards this study of literature with networks. And yeah, there is much more large scale research into character typology and into play structures with DraCor and DraCor networks. So I'll leave it to you for if you wish, you can go to the research page on DraCor website and look at what else has been done. And I will go further because I don't have much time left. And I will speak now a bit about large scale. So this is the last part of research, of this research part of the presentation. I will speak about the other types of analysis beyond networks. So of course, DraCor doesn't only deliver networks, it also, as I said, delivers the structurally segmented parts of the plays. And they are also interesting object of research. So here, for a change, I took Polish examples, and you can guess, of course, that these are stage directions. So all this, comes smiling, or falling from a horse on a sword and dies, this kind of stuff. And they're actually quite an interesting object of research as well, because they're this paratext which changed quite a lot during the years. So for instance, we did once this experiment of just measuring how big they are and how big a share they compose in a play. And it turns out that for instance, in the Russian corpus, if you take the beginning of it, so like the 18th century, they are really small and really technical. So they're basically adverbial, like comes laughingly or something like that, you know, or crying. And towards the end, they really become like a small chapters of narrative text, of basically epic narrative within the play. So there are, you know, characters dying, whole big sentences there. You know, there's a lot of more verbs in them now. And this really correlates to this idea, which was expressed at some point by Bertolt Brecht, of course, of epic theater. And I think this is really interesting to see that, to be able to measure that. And this is the only way you can measure it is actually with using something like TI, which encodes it, and then DraCor, which gives you the data. And another interesting example of using these stage directions not in diachronic manner, but actually in synchronic manner. So my German colleagues once recently tried to compare different types of drama according to which kind of requisites, or which kind of props, which kind of objects are mentioned in the stage directions. And what they found is basically that while prosaic drama has a preference for firearms and coffee, the verse drama has a preference for cold steel weapons, so for daggers and knives and swords. And of course, you can say, yeah, it's probably because verse drama, because historical drama is mainly written in verse, and yeah, that's true, of course. So this is not much of a discovery, but I would say still it gives you the perspective of what's possible and which kind of additional tools you can use to study poetics of different types of drama through this kind of data. And of course, you can study character speech texts as well, separately from stage directions, because they are separated. And this also gives you some perspective beyond network analysis. So for instance, many colleagues did stylometric studies on speeches, for instance, comparing how distinguishable characters are from each other. So do they possess their own ideolect? Which are more distinguishable? Are women more distinguishable than men? What are the different topics about men and women speak, for instance? This is also possible. Or for instance, they learn that some characters are really distinguishable just because they speak in some form of dialect. So this is also interesting, all this insight into character ideolect, so to speak, something that basically John Frederick Burroughs started with before he even invented delta and stylometry. Yeah, and for all such large-scale analysis, of course, downloading data manually, like I showed before, with the, clicking the buttons and all this, is not really a good solution. So we have other data delivery options, and the main of them is DraCor API. An API is basically a set of functions available through the web. So basically, you can, query the website asking, okay, give me corpus metadata for Polish corpus, or give me network data of the following place, or give me text of the stage directions of the following place, and so on. And the beauty of it is that the result is not returned to you in some form of XML, which you need to parse. It's actually returned to you basically in a table, which you can open in Excel and analyze, even probably without any code. And this is how API looks on the website, but really that's not the API. The point of API is not looking at it from the website, but actually using it from the code without even involving browsers. So that's the point. And here I list some of the examples which you can just click. I will probably send out the presentation if you like. For instance, here is the API calls which allows you to get all the female character text of all female characters' speech in Goethe's Faust. Yeah, and you can just click on it and get the data. So you see it works. Or you can get all the network metrics in Shakespeare's Hamlet. So basically, what I used, this will be the data that I used to replicate Moretti's little research. Or you can get the text of all stage directions in display by Gabriela Zapolska. Or you can get all the metadata of all plays in the current Polish corpus. Or you can get, for instance, the speech text of all son characters. So every character who is somebody's son in the play in Schiller's The Räuber. And this is not possible for every corpus, only for those where the relationships are marked, but still. There are some corpora in which they are marked, and this is what becomes possible when you do that, when you do this markup and provide an API for it. And there are also wrappers on top of wrappers. So API is already a wrapper above the data, but also there is, for instance, the Python package, which you can use to access those things without even resorting to this API queries. So you can just instead of using the API, you can install the Python package and work with all this data natively in Python, you know, obtaining it as Python objects, as dictionaries and lists, basically. And the last thing I'm going to say about the technological side of it is that it's also now possible to run one's own DraCor locally. And this is not very easy at the moment, but it's possible, and it's been done already by some people here, including some people sitting here, like Agnieszka. Yeah, and actually, currently we have a PhD student who is doing this for his dissertation. So, and the main purpose of this is actually when you need to store something that's copyright protected, but still want to have a DraCor on it, still want to use all these possibilities to, you know, produce networks and output network metrics on it. So this is really something which allows you to carry a DraCor on a flash drive, basically. Yeah, and now finally I'm done with talking about the technological side. So thanks for bearing with me. I see nobody fell asleep. That's really good. And now let's talk a bit, like finally, a couple of final slides. Let's talk about DraCor as a community. So as I said, DraCor is really a grassroots movement. So it's a volunteer community. It started 10 years ago with just a bunch of German academic dudes, let's say, sitting late together at Heine House in Göttingen and encoding some place for fun. And yeah, it's grown ever since. Now the community is bigger, but it's still kind of, you know, it still has this garage spirit, so this garage hackathon spirit. So we are still very non-hierarchical. We don't have any formal directors, we don't have any formal positions in DraCor. It's just like we go around, gather corpora, involve other people, asks other people to join us. Like when I was doing this Ukrainian corpus, we just went next door basically and found some Ukrainians who helped us with creating the list of plays of Ukrainian canonical drama. So this is really a sort of a kind of a club, a fun activity. And speaking of fun activity, we also have among other things, we have a card game. So we don't have a CD, but we have a card game. So I also have some material artifact here. So this is a card game based on DraCor. Its German version is called Dramenquartett, and its international version, which I'm holding here, is called Brecht beat Shakespeare. And it's basically a didactic game which allows people to learn about what different network metrics actually mean for drama, or how they look in different dramatic plays, while playing against each other in this, you know, top trumps style. I'll explain later in the coffee break if you wish. It's actually playable. So we actually did 2 championships. So the first championship happened in 2019, and maybe you will be, you know, rejoiced to know that it was actually won by Poland. Joanna Byszuk, the member of Krakow Computational Statistics Group, actually won the championship. I was there, I witnessed it. So she won the championship, and she held the title of the champion of Dramenquartett until very recently, actually. The second championship happened in 2024, and yeah, sadly it was won by Canada. But maybe the Poland will make a comeback at some point, or maybe we hold it here, and then Poland surely will win. Yeah. Okay, so I'm approaching the end of my. I have still 2 minutes, which is perfect because I have just a couple of slides left, and then we have 15 minutes for discussion, I think. So finally, the promised grain of salt, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Anyway. I was trying to make it full screen, but anyway. The promised grain of salt, maybe, what DraCor isn't, and yeah, the big coming out. I came to a conference on Digital Scholarly Edition to tell you that DraCor is not a Digital Scholarly Edition, by which I mean that, yeah, so if you were looking for Digital Scholarly Editions in DraCor, yeah, don't go there. These aren't the Digital Scholarly Editions you're looking for. By which I mean that DraCor is a bit too crude and streamlined for a Digital Scholarly Edition. So DraCor really is this kind of a crude hammer, which, you know, will hammer everything into a very basic TI without any kind of you won't get, like, for instance, different parallel versions of the same text. You know, all these things that TI is so big about, that TI, you know, that all this critical apparatus thing, all this really nuanced possibilities of encoding different readings and interpretations and different parallel versions of the same text. So none of this is possible in DraCor at the moment, at least. So we don't really do that, and we don't really take this kind of TIs. So we streamline TIs, even if they are more complex. We streamline them, so you can really think of it as a hammer, which turns everything not into nails, but into networks, actually. Yeah, and this is the caveat which I promised to deliver. And if we go back to, for instance, what Gregor was saying here and to what the description of this conference was actually saying, so about this balance between complexity of digital humanities data in specific projects and the desire to standardize them, well, you can see on which side DraCor is. So there is not really that much of a balance. We really are on the side of desire to standardize them. Otherwise, we just wouldn't be able to support this 20 corpora in, I think, 16 different languages and dialects at the moment with almost 4,000 plays. So this is really the kind of the bad side of it, or the dark side of it. So we have to make some compromises, and maybe not all of them are very good, because again, these networks, for instance, they're quite reductionist in a way, and not always this model is very useful. But this hammer here appears to be useful to quite a number of people. So if you go to the research page of DraCor, you will see that the papers written on the basis of DraCor are written by quite a number of people, which I would say by an order of magnitude is by an order of magnitude bigger than the size of the original team. And I think that's something to value, because again, as I said, I think there's quite a lot of digital humanities projects which just end up being used by the core team, by the team which has created them. And DraCor is one of the exceptions. I mean, I wouldn't say it's the only one. There are many, but it's one of the exceptions where people not from the developer team are actually using it regularly for their own research. So yeah, with this I conclude. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, dziękuję. And yeah, let's open the floor for questions.